Hello and welcome back. We've been journeying through the key parts of the Bible very slowly. So far, we're in the middle of Abraham's life. Abraham was initially called Avram. The name Avram means exalted father. And we've mentioned how in this culture, your name is part of what determines your identity. And what's striking about that is Avram, or exalted father, had no children. And in that culture, we've mentioned how that was considered a curse. You're cursed if you can't have a child, because the other part of what makes up your identity is your family line. And if you don't have children, your family line ceases to exist, which means your identity ceases to exist. As long as you have children, and especially male children, then your family line and your family name continues on, and therefore you continue to exist as long as your descendants continue to exist. So Avram, exalted father, was going through life with people saying, "Hey, exalted father," who has no kids, and probably getting a good chuckle out of that at Avram's expense. And Avram left because this god, one of the many gods people worshipped, came to him and somehow told him, "Leave this place, leave your family, leave everything, and go to a place that I'll show you." And Avram said, "Wait, you're giving me descendants? That's wonderful. And yeah, I'll do it." And instead of fully obeying, he didn't fully obey. He actually went with his father and some of his family and settled in Haran, a similar city in Mesopotamia. And eventually, after his father died, he left with his nephew Lot and continued on the way to the land of Canaan. But he settled down in Canaan, and when I say settled, I use that word loosely. He was really wandering around, living in tents, and people in that region, it wasn't like living in the big cities like Ur in Chaldea or Haran. You just kind of settle for a little bit. When you run out of resources, like food, water, whatever you need, then you move on until you find it and settle down again. And that's the lifestyle they were living there. Well, the Lord had told Avram, "I'm going to do three things for you." And the Lord made a covenant with Avram. And the Lord absolutely intended to keep this covenant. And here's what he said: "Avram, I'm going to give you descendants. You will have children, and your descendants will outnumber the stars of the sky. I'll give you land for those descendants to live in, specifically the land of Canaan. And three, all nations of the earth will be blessed through you." And Avram was thrilled with this. And he was about 75 years old when he left from Haran. And he got to Canaan, and he's wandering around for 10 years, and nothing happened. No child. In fact, there were famines in the land that God told him to go to. And Sarai, Avram's wife, was getting a little bit tired of hearing all this talk about descendants. Well, 10 years later, the Lord talked to Avram again and reaffirmed this covenant that he made. And Avram came home all excited, and his wife Sarai said, "Avram, it's not happening, right? We came all the way out here. We're living in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by rocks, and you don't have a child. It's been a full decade. Just stop. In fact, I know this means that much to you. Go and sleep with my servant Hagar, and you can just have a child through her." So Avram, of course, said, "Okay," and went and slept with Hagar, and right away she got pregnant, and she ended up giving birth to Ishmael. Well, Ishmael then would be Avram's firstborn son, and the firstborn son would carry on the family name, support the family, take care of the family, and continue on Avram's identity. And so Avram would be absolutely thrilled that Ishmael was born. Sarai, on the other hand, not so much. Now it's very clear that she is the one with the problem. She cannot have children. She can't do what is such a blessing for a woman in that culture to do, which is provide a child for her husband. And she would be sort of an outcast, and she'd be cursed. Avram is doing great now. This man named Exalted Father actually is a father finally. And Avram loved Ishmael deeply, very, very deeply. Well, some time went by, And Avram was 99 years old. So 14 years later, the Lord appeared to Avram again and said, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless. I will establish my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you exceedingly. Avram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with you. And let me pause there. The covenant was to give Avram descendants and land. And the descendants, as far as Avram was concerned, would obviously be coming through Ishmael, the firstborn son. Right? All those kind of big deal promises and a lot of wealth and everything goes to the firstborn son, because that's the one who is responsible for the family. And so Avram is thrilled. God is reaffirming that, yes, I will use Ishmael to do this thing. Well, you, God continues, you will be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Avram, but your name shall be called Avraham, or Abraham. For I will make you the father of a multitude of nations. Well, Avram means exalted father. God changed his name to Avraham, which means father of many. And he goes on talking about this covenant. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you, a lasting covenant to be God to you and to your descendants after you. I'll give you and your descendants the land of Canaan as an everlasting possession. I will be their God. And then God tells him he's he wants Abraham to circumcise himself and all his children, all his descendants. Circumcision was God's sign of this covenant. Right? So God's not actually adding a condition to the covenant. The covenant God made with Abraham was unconditional. No matter what Abraham does or does not do, God will keep that covenant. He'll give Abraham descendants, he'll give those descendants land, and he'll make them a blessing to all nations. But anybody who's descended from Abraham, the sign that they're actually part of that covenant is circumcision. So I'm sure Abraham had a couple questions about that, but he kind of went with it. And then God says this. God said to Abraham, As for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her. Indeed, I will give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she will be the mother of nations. Kings and peoples will come from her. Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said in his heart, Will a child be born to a man 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, Oh, that Ishmael might live before you. Right, God, I have Ishmael. Well, you don't need to do all that, right? Well, I'm 100 years old. She's 90 years old. It's just we're beyond childbearing years. I have Ishmael. Just let this happen for Ishmael, right? And this is what Abraham thought all along. It's been 13 years, and Abraham just assumed Ishmael was the one, and now he finds out, no, Ishmael's not the one. It's a son who will be born specifically to Sarah, Abraham's wife. And so God's saying, yeah, I forgot to add that little detail. I thought it was kind of assumed that I meant your wife and not Hagar, the servant, right? So this time I'm making clear you will have a child with your wife, and that child is the one who will inherit this promise. Well, of course, Abraham went home and he circumcised himself. He circumcised Ishmael. Ishmael was 13 years old. And he walked in and said, Honey, I'm home. It's so good to see you, Sarah. And Sarai said, Who? What did you just call me? Oh, yeah, I had another conversation with the Lord, Yahweh. And Sarai would go, oh, here we go again. Right? As long as they've been married, right, women would generally marry in their early teens, men in their late teens, early 20s. So they've probably been married for figure 75 years, 80 years, and he's been calling her Sarai for 75 years. And all of a sudden he says, oh yeah, the Lord told me to change your name to Sarah. Well, I don't know how Sarah would have felt about this. Scripture doesn't really tell us, but just, imagine being in that situation. Your husband comes home and says, oh, I'm not calling you that name anymore that I've called you for the last 50 years. I'm calling you a different name now. That would be a little challenging, right? Well, the names themselves, when God changes somebody's name, it's very significant because, like we've mentioned before, the name is that person's identity. The name sort of sums up who that person is. And when I read through this text, I used to find myself a little confused because Abraham, the name Avram meant exalted father. Avraham means father of many, right? There's a different meaning, but not that different. Sarai means princess. Sarah would mean exalted princess. And, exalted princess, I guess, is better than princess, but a princess is already pretty exalted. So, how much different is it really? And this kind of puzzled me for quite a while. And then the more I learned about the Hebrew language and the culture and the worldview, one of the things that I've learned is that letters themselves have certain meanings to them. In Hebrew, there's a letter Aleph, which is sort of in some ways equivalent to the letter A in English. And the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Beit, which is like our letter B. And the Aleph, in the early Hebrew lettering, the way they would write the Hebrew letters very, very early in history, before the language evolved to what it is today, it looked kind of like the head of an ox. And the Aleph, then, the letter Aleph, signifies the head of something, strength and leadership. Beit, the early alphabet, was shaped in the shape of a house. And Beit actually meant house. Well, when you put Aleph, the head, with Beit, the house, you get Ab, or it could be Av. That letter Beit can be pronounced like a V sound. Av means father. Father is the head of the house. And in Hebrew, that's a lot of words are put together that way. You have letters with meanings, you combine these meanings into a word, and that word has meanings associated with some of those letters, right? Not all words are like that, many are. And what I've learned is that the equivalent to the letter H in Hebrew is the letter He, and it's a very breathy letter, right? H is kind of like it's got that ch sound, but He is all breath. Hey, right? And the breath just comes. And the letter itself had to do with wind, breath, spirit. And spirit is one of the several meanings of the letter He. And when you look at what God did with their names, in English, in the English alphabet, Avram would be A-V-R-M. The Hebrew alphabet doesn't have vowels built into it. So A-V-R-M. In Hebrew, it's the letter Aleph, Beit, Resh, Mem. And Aleph, Beit, as we said, Av is the head of the house, the father. And so that's the meaning of the word Av. And then Resh, Mem is the rest of that. So Avram is exalted father. Well, God changed his name to Avraham, Abraham. So you still have the Av, the father, but instead of Aleph, Beit, Resh, Mem, you have the letter He inserted in there. And the letter He has to do with breath and spirit. God is saying, you are the same person you were before, only I'm inserting my spirit into your identity. And the same with Sarai. And this is a little more complicated because of things that change with Hebrew grammar, but essentially it's the same thing. God took Sarai, Shin, Resh, Yod, and made it, he inserted the letter He into that, Shin, Resh, He, and for Hebrew grammatical reasons, the yod kind of disappears. But all God did really was insert that letter. Hey, you are still Sarai, but you're Sarai with my spirit in you, Sarah. Avram, you're no longer going to be called exalted father. You're going to be called father of many with my spirit in you. And Sarai is not just princess, but exalted princess with my spirit in her. And so when God changes their names, he changes their identities. Their identities now have everything to do with the presence of the Lord in them. So the name change there, it actually is extremely significant. Well, next passage we read about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So a couple of angels show up, men. I'm not clear whether Abraham actually recognized these men as angels and God, or if he thought they were men, or what the deal was. But either way, these men show up, and we find out that it's some angels and God himself are there talking with Abraham. In this conversation, Abraham says, I'm going to come back in a year, and you're going to have a child through your wife, Sarah. Right? Just to be clear this time, talking about your wife. So Sarah, everybody lives in tents. Sarah is in the next tent making some food for these guests, and she laughs. I'm 90 years old. I'm going to have this pleasure of having a child. The word pleasure there actually may mean something a little bit deeper than having a child, too. Look at him. He's 100 years old. Is he going to give me that pleasure that it takes to, make a child? She's laughing at this whole idea. And the one of the men turns and says to Abraham, "Why did your wife laugh?" And she yells back from the tent, "I didn't laugh." And we find out this is God talking, and says, "You did so laugh," right? They're having this little argument back and forth between the tent walls. Awesome moment. But then the Lord starts telling Abraham that Sodom and Gomorrah, these two nearby cities, the sin is so great there. The stuff they're doing is so horrible that God is going to judge these cities. And Abraham panics a little bit because his nephew Lot lives in one of those cities. And he starts this sort of negotiation process with God. People read into this things, but this is just the way of life in the Middle East. You negotiate like this. You sort of go back and forth in negotiations. And Avram gets the Lord to commit to saying, if I find even 10 righteous people in the city, I will not destroy the city. And I'm sure Abraham is still a little apprehensive. The two angels, meanwhile, they're on their way to Sodom, and they sit down in the town square. And here's a place where you need to really understand the culture. All right, there's a lot of stuff going on here that us in the West that we generally just don't fully understand it. We misunderstand it. But culturally, there are a few important things to know. All right, first, hospitality is expected and vital in the Middle East. So if somebody new comes into town, you as a resident of the town are expected to provide hospitality for that person. It was just a way of life. It was the way you don't question it. You don't even ask why. You just do it. It's the way we do things. Well, these two angels went into the town, these two strangers, and they're there in the marketplace. Nobody paid any attention to them. Finally, Lot happened to be walking by. He saw these men and invited them into the house. And the two angels end up going with them. They look like men. They appear like men. Lot just figured they're men. And Lot brings them home. He starts making a big feast for them, and that's just what you do in that culture. If I went to the Middle East, even today, and I needed a place, I probably could just kind of, if I was in the right part of the Middle East, I could just wander around. Somebody would take me into their house, and if they did, they would lavish me with everything I could possibly want. Part of what will help to understand this passage is this. There are cultural expectations on both sides of this. right? So somebody is just, you almost have to take in people, take in guests into your house. And if you do that, you are required to lavish them with everything. Even the poorest people, if you are invited into their house as a guest, they'll take the little that they have and just lavish you with anything you could possibly imagine. And that's just expected. That's the way of life. Well, in exchange, you, as the guest, you bring honor to those people who are doing this. So if I went to the Middle East and I were invited to stay with a family, I would go in there. The family would offer me everything I could possibly want, but I don't dare ask for anything. So this is an honor and shame culture. Honor and shame drive this culture, and the greatest thing you can do is gain honor for your family. The worst thing you can do is bring shame on your family, because remember, it's not me as an individual who's shamed, it's my entire family that's shamed or honored. And so, as a guest, it doesn't matter how long I've been out in the hot desert sun, I don't dare ask for a glass of water, because if I ask for a glass of water, that implies that my guests are not providing for that my hosts rather are not providing for my needs, and therefore they are bad hosts, and shame will come upon that family. So I'm just expected to not ask for anything, right? So there are all these expectations on both sides of this. They're just unspoken rules that everybody follows. Well, Lot prepares this huge feast for these two men. Lot has two daughters, and as time goes on, we find out that all the men of the city came and they started knocking on the door. All right, so I'll read, this is in Genesis 19. I'll start at verse 4. After they ate dinner, before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, surrounded the house, both young and old, all the people from every quarter. All right, so this is not a handful of men who thought that these two guests were cute and they were homosexual and they wanted to sleep with these two men. It wasn't that at all. This passage is really not about homosexuality, and that a lot of people don't get that. Right? All of the men of the city surrounded the house, and they went to the door and they called to Lot and demanded, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may have relations with them." All right. Again, this is not a matter of men being attracted to other men. This isn't about attraction. It's all the men of the city. And listen to the conversation. Lot went out to them and shut the door and said, "Please, my brothers, do not act wickedly. Behold, I have two daughters who have not yet had relations with man. Please let me bring them out to you and do to them whatever you like, only do nothing to these men, insomuch as they have come under the shelter of my roof." Right, now I'll get to the daughters in a moment, but listen to the response by the men. The men of the city, and remember it's men from all over the whole city, said, "Stand aside." And then they said, "This one," speaking of Lot, "came in as an alien, and already he is acting like a judge. We will treat you worse than them." Right? And I hope you caught that. We will treat you, Lot, worse than we treat those two men. In other words, this was not about attraction. Right? There's nothing here about homosexual attraction, homosexual relationships, any of that. This was a matter of all the men of the city came and surrounded the house to mistreat those men. They were going to treat those men badly, and they knew that it was bad. And Lot, if you get in the way, will treat you even worse. So this is about gang rape, a violent act to send a signal to the whole region: don't come here. We don't want you. We don't want strangers. We don't want anybody here. So they pressed hard against Lot, and they came near to break the door. But the men, the two angels, reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house and shut the door. They struck the men at the doorway with blindness, both small and great, so that they wearied themselves trying to find the doorway. Right? Even being struck blind doesn't stop these men from trying to get in and gang rape these visitors to the town. The men said to Lot, "Who else is here? You have a son-in-law, your sons, your daughters, anybody you have in the city, get everything together. We are going to get you out of here, and we're going to destroy this place. All right, so let's backtrack a bit. The whole town then is planning to gang rape these two men, and they may now do that to Lot as well, because he's trying to interfere with their plans. And the angels are going to destroy things. But I want to hit this passage about the daughters, because this sounds like just utter blatant disregard for women. And there is that in this culture, but it's not exactly what's going on here. All right, so I mentioned the expectations. You have cultural expectations of hospitality, and there are expectations on both sides of that hospitality. Well, here, these men from the city know all the unspoken rules about hospitality. When you have a guest, you lavish your guests with everything they want, and you're responsible for their safety and protection. And again, if you don't protect your guests, shame comes on your family. Well, when Lot said, listen, I have two daughters who have never been with a man, let me bring them out to you, and you can do with them whatever you want, Lot was not being literal. All right, so remember, in the Middle East, people spoke metaphorically all the time. They spoke with figures of speech. They say things that are completely, fully understood by the local people in the region. For us to take this literally is to miss the point of what Lot was actually saying. Right? Lot was not literally offering the men his daughters. That's not what they were there for. They weren't there for a good time. Right? They were there to treat these two men horribly. What Lot is saying here is this: take my two daughters instead of these men, because I am going to fulfill my responsibility to protect these men. And to say that this way, Lot was saying, when Lot said, I'll give you my daughters before I give you these guests, he wasn't just saying my daughters are worthless, they're just women, take them. That's not at all what he was saying. He was saying that I will protect my guests. And if the men actually turned to him and said, okay, fine, we'll take your daughters, Lot would have said, get out of here, and he would have gone back inside and shut the door and locked it. He would not have actually gone through with it. It's saying, take my two daughters instead of my guests, is a cultural way of saying, I would give you my daughters before I give you my guests, right? And you would never actually do that. You wouldn't go through with it. It's just a way of saying, I am protecting my guests, period. So give it up. All right, so anyway, the men, they continue on. The angels strike them with blindness. The angels get Lot and his family out. They get far enough away from the city. The angels say, don't turn around, don't look back, just keep on going. Lot's wife looked back, which could mean she just kind of stopped and turned around and looked. Most likely, it means she had second thoughts and actually started going back to the city. I'm not sure which is the better interpretation of that. But either way, she turned back, and the Lord sent fire from heaven, like just fire. Think like lightning strike, atomic blast, volcano, whatever image you want to use. The city was just destroyed. Sodom, Gomorrah, the whole region was just destroyed with fire. And Lot's wife, who had turned back, turned into a pillar of salt. Right? Why a pillar of salt? I have no idea. Sodom and Gomorrah supposedly are either near or under the Dead Sea, depending on some conditions and stuff. I read a couple years back now that people have found actually where Sodom and Gomorrah were. I have no idea how true that is. Where they say it was, I really thought would have been under what is now the Dead Sea, but who knows? I don't know for sure. But anyway, it's in that region, the region of the Dead Sea, most likely on the east side of the Dead Sea. And whatever happened, God just destroyed the whole thing. The Dead Sea is called the Dead Sea because it's completely filled with salt. It's like almost more salt than water. I'm in New Jersey, and when I go to the ocean here, if I go swimming in the ocean, you get a little seawater in your mouth, and you can taste the salt. It's kind of gross. But it's about 3% salt. That's the Atlantic Ocean, is about 3% salt. Well, the Dead Sea is more than 30% salt. Nothing can grow in the Dead Sea. That's why it's called that. So there are pillars of salt everywhere, and apparently there's one huge pillar of salt that people say is Lot's wife. Whatever. But there is actually a lot of salt in that region, though. But that's Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Next thing that happens, there's another famine in the land. And so Sarah, who has been told that a year later she would have a child, she laughed at it, and God said, no, really, it's going to happen. Well, then there's a famine, and they end up going not to Egypt this time, but a little bit west to the region of Philistia, where the Philistines live. And the king of the Philistines thought Sarah was pretty cute. Apparently, she was still really good looking at 90 years old. And he took her and took her as a wife. This time, we're specifically told that the king did not sleep with her. God actually kept the king from sleeping with her. And I'm baffled and fascinated by this. Right? First of all, just that Abraham thought this was a good idea a second time. He did this already in Egypt, and he's doing it again here. But then also, the risk Abraham took, God just told him, a year from now, your wife will have a child. Well, then he goes to the Philistine area and just gives his wife to the Philistine king as a wife. If she ended up part of the harem, and she did, but when the king went to sleep with her, God just stopped him, just outright stopped him. Had the king actually slept with her, the child that would have been born to Sarah would have been the Philistine king's child, not Abraham's child, and the whole promise of God would have been just thwarted. So I really don't know what Abraham was up to there. I almost wonder if Abraham did that on purpose, hoping that, well, now the baby is not mine, it's that king's, and so God, you'll have to use Ishmael now. Right? I kind of wonder if maybe that's what was happening. But either way, God spares Sarah from that happening. They end up back in the land and getting even wealthier off that little transaction of Abraham's. And then finally, the time comes when Isaac is born. So this is where we'll stop with this session. And in the next session, we'll talk about the life of Isaac and what happens next. So I hope to see you again, and thank you very much.